Hey, what is up guys, Merkinman4 here, and today I'm going to be discussing the most recent collection set, Season 17. It's Tom Baker's penultimate season, the conclusion of Graham Williams' era as producer, and it's home to some of the show's most infamous production nightmares. So, what does the end result look like? Let's find out. So, I want to admit right off the bat that much as I love Tom Baker's Doctor, of course I do, I really don't gel with the Williams years. I find that the Fourth Doctor's silliness is just taken to the extreme. It's generally good in isolation, but there's just so much of it that it often comes across as forced. And many of the stories feel undercooked, and the production issues are far more glaring than usual. To be blunt, in my opinion, seasons 15, 16, and 17 are some of the weakest seasons that the show has ever produced. But that's not to say that they're entirely without value. Still Doctor Who, after all. But with that, why don't we dive into Season 17. Destiny of the Daleks is a noteworthy story for a number of reasons. It's the debut of Romana's second incarnation, as played by Lalla Ward. It marks the first return of Dalek creator Davros after his debut in Genesis of the Daleks. And it also serves as the last contribution of the show from Terry Nation, the Daleks' real-world creator. Plus, it also introduces a new enemy for the Daleks in the form of the Movellans, whom they've been locked in war with for centuries. And with all that, sorry to say that Destiny ends up being a fairly underwhelming affair. There's not a lot that's actively bad about it, but on the flip side, there's not a whole lot that's actively good either. The guest characters are completely unremarkable, the setting's fairly bland. Isn't it ironic that perhaps the most successful portrayal of Skaro was in its very first appearance? And the Daleks themselves leave a lot to be desired. Not just in the tatty and rundown props, but also in their characterization, which is rather baffling coming from their original creator. For whatever reason, Terry Nation decides to treat the Daleks as robots, solely relying on logic, which reads a lot more like the Cybermen than the Daleks. I think it's a great idea for them to seek out their original creator for help, but I can't think of any other era of the show where they would reach an impasse of logic. The Daleks have always been adaptable and willing to deviate from logical strategy if it helps them get their way. Despite that, I do think that Davros is written rather well here, and he's portrayed admirably by David Gooderson, taking over the role from Michael Wisher. And there are some great moments for the Doctor and Davros to bounce off each other. It's a shame he's only in half the story, since he's probably the best thing about it. Well, aside from Tom Baker. As mentioned, Lalla Ward also makes her debut here as Romana too, and while her performance is good, and it's obvious she has a lot of chemistry with Tom Baker, her actual role in the story is pretty insubstantial, and the regeneration scene is just weird. There's no other way to put it. All in all, Destiny of the Daleks is fine, I guess. It's a perfectly watchable story, and it certainly isn't boring, but it just doesn't do very much that's interesting or memorable, and compared to the other Dalek stories, there's no question that it's near the bottom. So I'll be giving this story a 6 out of 10. Not the strongest start to the season. And in amongst the unremarkable, we have a gem. City of Death is, in my opinion, not just the best story of Season 17, but the best of the entire latter half of the Fourth Doctor's run. Now, part of that is admittedly down to the company it keeps. I'll give a little bit of a spoiler, but out of his last 4 seasons, there's only 2 stories I'd rate higher than an 8 out of 10, and I've already reviewed the other one. But even that aside, it's a remarkable story in its own right. Genuinely filming parts of the story in Paris gives a fantastic atmosphere. The guest cast are all extremely entertaining, particularly Julian Glover as Scarleone/Scaroth. The comedy's on top form. It's a strong contender for one of the show's funniest stories in my books, and it's all built around a fascinating concept of a being split across time and trying to undo his former actions to save his species. Given that the story was rewritten practically from the ground up over the course of just a few days, it's remarkable just how well it comes together. I admittedly don't think it quite deserves to be in the top 10 stories of all time, which is where it had previously been rated in Doctor Who Magazine's last series-wide poll, but that said, It's easy to see why it's such a popular story, and the end result is a massively entertaining hour and a half. Man, does it feel good to have a story like this here, as there's no doubt in my mind that City of Death is worthy of a 9 out of 10. And just like that, we're back down in the pits. Pun definitely intended. In all seriousness, The Creature from the Pit isn't a bad story, it's just incredibly unremarkable. I mean, it's a nice concept, a seemingly monstrous alien actually being a captive innocent of a greedy ruler, but the finished story works against it. The setting just feels bland, the guest characters are hard to care about, with the exception of Jeffrey Belden's Organon, who's genuinely a joy to watch. And the execution of the eponymous creature is, let's just stick with infamous. The first and final parts are where the story's at its most interesting, but the middle, as well as a subplot with the bandits, or whatever they are, is much more challenging to be invested in. Honestly, it's perfectly watchable, but the story's biggest crime is that I just don't feel like there's anything worth discussing about it. It's another 6 out of 10. This is a strange one. It's far from the best the show's ever looked, with the production issues and limited budget often painfully obvious. Some of the creative choices made by the cast are, let's say, questionable, and the subject matter about drug smuggling is very unusual territory for Doctor Who. Put that all together, and Nightmare of Eden doesn't have a great reputation. Now, that being said, I don't think it's as bad as some would suggest. I'm inclined to agree with most of the criticisms towards it, yes, but I think that the stuff that does work generally works fairly well, and to be perfectly honest, it's just a lot more fun than what much of the Williams era has to offer. Even though it feels out of place in the show as a whole, I actually think that the drug storyline works rather well here, and it's a fascinating idea to smuggle it via a projected slice of a planet. Amongst the more over-the-top ones, there are actually some really good performances in here too. David Dacre's portrayal of Captain Rigg as he descends into drug-fueled mania is genuinely excellent, as is Tom Baker's understated disgust at Triss near the end of the story. And I have to be honest, I rather like the design of the mandrills. Yes, they could be shot a bit better, but it's quite a striking design that's genuinely scary when they're shot properly. Now, I know I've been giving the story a lot of compliments, but that's mainly just because all the bad stuff's been talked about to death, and as I said, I do still agree with many of the criticisms towards it. So, that unfortunately doesn't mean much for Nightmare of Eden. I'll be putting it on the same level as Destiny and Creature. I think the issues here are more egregious, but I have a better time with it, so I think a 6 out of 10 pretty much balances it out. It's a good thing Shada was completed a few years back, because this makes for an underwhelming conclusion to the season, to put it mildly. Look, there's no beating around the bush here. The Horns of Nimon is often considered to be one of the worst Doctor Who stories of all time. The production values are shoddy, the acting's all over the place, and there definitely isn't enough story to fill 4 episodes. And unlike the other stories of the season, where despite their issues I could always find something to compliment, I unfortunately can't say the same here. The closest I can get is that Graham Crowden's manic portrayal of Soldeed is admittedly quite entertaining, and honestly I'd even say fitting for the character. Yes, even his death scene. But it's such a fine line between hilarious and cringeworthy that I really don't think I'd consider it a positive if the surrounding story were actually any good. I won't go so far as to say it's the worst Doctor Who story out there, but it's not far off. So, Soldeed, how many Nimons have you seen today?
3. I have seen 3.
Huh, what a coincidence. That's the same as the score I'll be giving the story. Your dreams of conquest are gonna have to wait. And at last we reach the infamous Shada, the only story to enter production but never completed. Thankfully, we now have the 2017 animation to be able to judge the story in full, and ever since the completion of the animation, I'd say Shada's just as valid a television story as any other. So with that said, how does the story come together? Quite well, to be honest. At the very least, it's head and shoulders above the rest of the season, bar City of Death. The location filming really adds to the feel of the story. The guest cast are all entertaining to watch, and the scale is suitably epic. It has some of the best humor of the season too, though that isn't too surprising given it's a Douglas Adams script. Interestingly, Shada really does feel like a season finale, which is unusual for classic Who. It gives it a unique feeling, even setting aside the fact that half of it's animated. Honestly, my only real issue with the story is that it's perhaps a tad long at 6 parts. Though with that said, it's still better paced than many of the 4-parters I've talked about today. All in all, it's a really solid conclusion to the season, and indeed the Graham Williams era as a whole, and I'm glad it was finally completed, even if it was 40-odd years later than intended. Shada earns itself a solid 8 out of 10 in my books. So I think it goes without saying that Season 17's a bit of a bumpy ride. It's not without its highlights. Tom Baker's a joy to watch as always. Lalla Ward makes an impressionable debut as Romana's second incarnation, and we do get a genuinely fantastic story in City of Death. But the season also has some fairly low lows, and the majority is unfortunately just bland and forgettable. At the end of the day, I don't have a bad time with this season. I really don't think that there's any season that's worse than okay, with the sole exception of Season 24. But there's also very little here that makes me eager to revisit it. If I'm in the mood for the 4th Doctor, I'm going to be headed straight for the Hinchcliffe years. And with that, it's time to enter Season 17 into the rankings of all the other seasons I've reviewed so far. But first, how the season stories compare to one another. Far and away, the best story of the season is City of Death, with a 9 out of 10, followed by Shada with an 8 out of 10, 3 6s in a row with Nightmare of Eden, Destiny of the Daleks, and The Creature from the Pit, and at last, The Horns of Nimon with a 3 out of 10. Altogether, the average score for Season 17 is an underwhelming 6.3, putting the season 3rd from the bottom of the 10 seasons I've reviewed so far. This means that the average score for the 1970s takes a bit of a hit, dropping to an average of 7.3 out of 10, while Tom Baker's era as a whole now drops below John Pertwee's with a new average of 7.25 out of 10. When it comes to Season 17's writers, only 2 fare well. Graham Williams, who co-wrote City of Death with Douglas Adams under a pseudonym, receives the 2nd place spot with a 9 out of 10, and Adams himself enters the ranking in 7th with an average of 8.5. Terry Nation drops to 18th place with a new average of 7.17, and just behind him is Bob Baker, whose first and only solo outing has dropped him a few spots to 19th with an average of 7.1. And our 3rd Season 17 writer in a row in 20th place is David Fisher, with a new average of 7 out of 10. Finally, Anthony Reed enters the ranking 3rd from the bottom in 30th place, with a measly 3 out of 10. Additionally, Graham Williams enters the producer's ranking in last place, finally giving JNT a break. And Douglas Adams' tenure as script editor sadly suffers from all the stories not written or co-written by him, bringing him 6th out of 7 script editors. Meanwhile, Season 17 sandwiches the director's list, with City of Death's 9 out of 10 score placing Michael Hayes at the top, and The Horns of Nimon's 3 out of 10 placing Kenny McBain at the very bottom. As for the other directors of the season, Pennant Robbers comes in 8th with an 8 out of 10 average, and just like with the writers category, we've got 3 directors in a row from 19th to 21st place, with Christopher Barry's 6.67 average and Alan Bromley and Ken Greaves' 6 out of 10 scores. When it comes to premieres, Destiny of the Daleks enters near the bottom in 8th place, bringing the premiere average to a 6.85 out of 10. Although Shada fares well in the finale category in 4th place, and increases that category's average to a 6.6. And when it comes to the top and bottom 10, Season 17 manages 1 entry in each. City of Death kicks Warrior's Gate out of the top 10, coming in at 8th place, whereas The Horns of Nimon takes a spot in the bottom 3 of the 53 stories I've reviewed so far. Elsewhere in the ranking, Shada comes in 22nd, at the bottom of the 8s, and Season 17's trio of 6s come in at 41st, 43rd, and 45th place, respectively. And that's Season 17. A largely middling affair that definitely isn't without its good bits, but ultimately leaves a lot to be desired. As I said earlier, it's perfectly serviceable, but I'm not going to be in a hurry to come back to it anytime soon. But hey, that's just me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the season down in the comments below. And with that, Morganman4 over and out, and I'll see you guys later with Season 22.